Hey, everybody, this is Joe Joseph, and this is the DailySheeple.com's Daily News Brief. I'm going to go a little bit off my standard approach tonight for the Daily News Brief, as I'm going to focus on one subject that has had very heavy consequences for us here in the United States and for many people throughout the world. And tonight, that subject is highlighted by an article by Zero Hedge that El Chapo has been extradited to the United States. Bad news for Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. On Thursday last week, Mexico's most notorious cartel kingpin, who twice brazenly escaped from prison and spent years on the run as the country's most wanted man, was extradited to the U.S. to face drug trafficking charges and other charges. In a major victory for the U.S. DEA, Mexico's Foreign Relations Department announced Guzman was handed over to U.S. authorities for transportation to the U.S. on Thursday, the last full day of President Barack Obama's administration, and a day before Donald Trump is to be inaugurated. Now, let me stop there for a second, because you got to wonder if that wasn't like a little snub to Trump for build that wall. Oh, we'll just give the credit to Obama. Very interesting. So anyway, El Chapo is in U.S. custody. As a matter of fact, as reported by the AP, a senior U.S. official at the DEA took custody of Guzman and Ciudad Juarez, which is across the border from El Paso, Texas, and a plane carrying him departed for New York at approximately 5:31 Eastern Time on Thursday. El Chapo was recaptured about a year ago, of course, everybody remembers, after a second maximum security prison escape through a tunnel dug to his cell. And he, of course, has been fighting extradition. And I can't quite say I blame him, because U.S. prison, of course, is no bueno, if you know what I mean. Now, a Mexican Foreign Relations Department statement said a court had ruled against Guzman's appeal to be extradited and found that his extradition would, of course, be constitutional. Obama's White House, which was down to a skeleton staff hours before Trump took office, had no immediate comment. And so what does this mean? Because El Chapo and people like him have been cronies of the U.S. government and of the shadow government, specifically the CIA, and a lot of the drug running that happens between Mexico, Central America, and the United States. And it's all allowed by the CIA. The CIA makes a ton of money on the war on drugs. Let me even back that up a little bit. Not just the CIA, the entire government itself. If you think about it. You have the Drug Enforcement Agency that basically justifies its entire existence on the war on drugs. You take that away, you do a legalization campaign. President Trump would have, of course, a very, very nice, hefty chunk of the government that he could just go. Pfft. Of course, today, he enacted a hiring freeze. And that's all well and good. Hiring freezes are great. However, there is so much extra. There is such a heavy burden on the American taxpayer to keep this monstrosity of a government running when it doesn't need to be this way at all. I mean, this is just over-governance on a massive scale. It's government getting into every nook and cranny of our lives. And one of those areas is what we decide we want to put in our bodies, how we want to treat ourselves, both medically, perhaps spiritually. And it doesn't matter what we want, even though we are all sovereign human beings, because, see, the almighty government God says something totally different. And, of course, in 1970, the Controlled Substances Act came about in the United States and outlawed and banned or scheduled a lot of medication, but further, a lot of herbs that God gave to every man, woman, and child on this planet to use as he or she saw fit. And I know a lot of people are like, well, people will kill themselves if that's happened. Well, I know it's going to sound a little insensitive, and bear with me if it is, But survival of the fittest has always been there. It always will be. And you can't save people from their own stupidity oftentimes. You can try, and sometimes you're successful, but not every time you're successful. Now, I want to go through a brief history of the war on drugs, brought to you by the Drug Policy Alliance. And if you don't know who the Drug Policy Alliance is, I would suggest that you check it out. Drugpolicy.org is their website. And they write the early stages of drug prohibition. Of course, many current illegal drugs such as marijuana, opium, coca, and psychedelics have been used for thousands of years for both medical and spiritual purposes. So why are some drugs legal and other illegal today? It's not based on any scientific assessment of the relative risks of these drugs, but it has everything to do with who is associated with these drugs. The first anti-opium laws in the United States came about in 1870, and they were directed at Chinese immigrants. The first anti-cocaine laws in the South in the early 1900s were directed at black men. The first anti-marijuana laws in the Midwest and Southwest in the 1910s and 20s were directed at Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. And today, Latinos and especially black communities are still subject to wildly disproportionate drug enforcement and sentencing practices. And in the 1960s, as drugs became symbols of youth rebellion, social upheaval, and political dissent, the government halted scientific research to evaluate their medical safety and efficiency. In 1971, President Nixon declared the war on drugs. He dramatically increased the size and presence of federal drug control agencies and pushed through measures such as mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. Nixon temporarily placed marijuana in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category on drugs, pending review by a commission he appointed, led by Republican Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer. And in 1972, the commission unanimously recommended decriminalizing the possession and distribution of marijuana for personal use. And Nixon, of course, we know the rest is history. He ignored the report and rejected its recommendations, which is very interesting because when you go to this report, folks, what you come to find out is that President Nixon was looking for ammunition to do two things. He was vilifying opiates, which is something that started around this time because he was getting a lot of flack from the African American communities, especially with regards to civil rights. And he also knew that opium and heroin was being pumped in to the African American communities during this time, along with other drugs. And it was easy pickings for him to go in there and start putting his opponents, and especially those loud voices that push back, into prison for something that really shouldn't be a crime at all. Because, folks, let's be honest. Everybody knows what's best for you, right? But really, who knows what's best for you? Of course, you do. And so it's important whenever you decide that you might want to treat an ailment or perhaps use something in a spiritual nature that you do your homework on it before you do it. And if you do it responsibly, then you really have nothing to worry about. However, if you go down the line of abuse and you may not be spiritually grounded, well, then you're open to become addicted to whatever substance you may try to imbibe or use, because normally when it comes from an abusive standpoint is where you end up running into issues. Now, the Schaefer Commission found this about marijuana, which is very interesting. And this is, again, back in 1972. They found that there was no significant physical, biochemical, or mental abnormalities that could be attributed solely to their marijuana smoking. There was no valid stereotype of a marijuana user or non-user. Young people who chose to experiment with marijuana are fundamentally the same people socially and psychologically as those who used alcohol and tobacco. No verification is found of a causal relationship between marijuana use and subsequent heroin use. That's interesting because you've always heard marijuana being touted as a gateway drug, which is absolutely unfounded, and it was unfounded in 1972. Most users, young and old, demonstrate an average or above average degree of social functioning, academic achievement, and job performance. In sum, the weight of evidence is that marijuana does not cause violent or aggressive behavior. If anything, marijuana serves to inhibit the expression of such behavior. That's right, because, I've known many people that have gone and smoked a joint and then had this sudden compulsion to go rob a bank. Because it just doesn't happen. They're more likely to eat themselves into a food coma before they do anything like that. But I digress. The report also said, in short, marijuana is not generally viewed by participants in the criminal justice community as a major contributing influence in the commission of delinquent or criminal acts. Okay, so if that's the case, then how come all these people that possess marijuana are being thrown in the slammer to make what? 25 cents an hour labor to make everything from military equipment to office furniture to textiles to electronic equipment. The prison industrial complex, my friends, is vast and needs to be constantly fed by cheap labor in order to be successful. Finally, marijuana's relative potential for harm to the vast majority of individual users and its actual impact on society does not justify a social policy designed to seek out and firmly punish those who use it. 1972. So, question, who didn't get the memo? Obviously, many people in government did not get the memo. But let's continue. Between 1973 and 1977, 11 states decriminalized marijuana possession. In January 1977, Jimmy Carter was inaugurated on a platform that included marijuana decriminalization. And in October 1977, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted to decriminalize possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana for personal use. And within just a few years, though, the tide had shifted. Proposals to decriminalize marijuana were abandoned as parents became increasingly concerned about the high rates of teen marijuana use. And marijuana was ultimately caught up in a broader cultural backlash against the perceived permissiveness of the 1970s. And then, of course, if you grew up during my time, which was the Reagan administration, you remember the old, dad walks in the room and there's Junior, kind of sitting there, and dad goes into the drawer and pulls out Junior's stash of weed and his thing. And then he's like yelling at his son and he asks, "Where did you learn this stuff?" And of course the son was like, "You are right. I learned it from watching you." The whole Just Say No campaign. Everybody remembers that. And of course, DARE is where that all came about. Oh, yeah. And of course, drug hysteria went nuts in the 80s and 90s. And of course, with that hysteria came an increase in incarceration rates because it already wasn't bad enough. But that prison industrial complex needed more and more and more. And it didn't just stop at marijuana. There's something that came about. The crack scare, if you remember, came about. Now, there is absolutely no difference between cocaine and between crack. It is chemically the exact same thing. The only difference is the delivery, how you do it. Crack, of course, is a smokable form of cocaine, where cocaine is normally snorted through the nose, and or if you have coca leaves, down south in South America and Central America, they simply roll up the leaves and stick them in their cheek. Very interesting that people don't realize and understand a lot of the medicinal benefits associated with coca. As a matter of fact, it was in the original Coca-Cola, hence the reason why coca is the first part of it. Now, interestingly enough, the number of people behind bars for nonviolent drug law offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 by 1997. That's how crazy this is. And a lot of it had to do with political hysteria about drugs. And, a lot of these families that pushed it were the Clintons and the Bushes, who, come to find out, Mena, Arkansas, they were involved in it too. And they're flying in cocaine, they're flying in drugs from Central and South America and selling it and making bank on this. And really, the Clintons' war on drugs, according to the New Republic, is when black lives didn't matter. And you can check out that article. It's in the description box below too, but they were intentionally shipping drugs in to the inner cities. And I mean, anybody out there should be furious about this. Here you are, a lot of people, Black Lives Matter. They're going and protesting Trump. You need to protest against the people you should be protesting against. It ain't Donald Trump. I mean, don't get me wrong. The guy has his problems. We all do. But he certainly wasn't shipping drugs into your communities. And that's the thing that you need to understand, is that we need to put the focus where the focus should be. We need to provide accountability where accountability should be. And we do not need to be overgoverned, which is exactly what is happening to us with regards to the war on drugs. It's that simple. And Columbia University professor Carl Hart gave us a great piece entitled 5 Tips for Decreasing Drug-Related Harms. So, a lot of people out there, you know that prohibition doesn't work. Donald Trump, of course, nominated and got Jeff Sessions to be his attorney general. And, of course, he doesn't care about facts. Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. He's going to go with the narrative that all drugs are bad and he knows what's best for you. And unfortunately, what that does is it creates unsafe environments for people to go, because they're going to get these things no matter what, how they want it. Only now it's going to be cut with dog crap and everything else, and it's not going to be pure, and there's not going to be safety measures in place, and people won't have safe places to go to do it, and there won't be safe formulations of it. Doesn't matter what it is, you know. People will find a way to do it. Well, Dr. Hart, Columbia University, 5 tips for decreasing drug-related harms. Listen to this. Over the past 15 years, I've given out thousands of doses of drugs like cocaine, marijuana, and methamphetamine to people. Says I do this as part of my research to understand how the drugs affect the brain, behavior, and physiology. Said late one summer night, I picked up my 17-year-old son from a party, a graduation celebration for one of his friends. As he got into the car, I noticed he was chewing a heavily minted scented gum. It occurred to me that some of the partygoers might have brought drugs and that they might have indulged. Given what I know from the Monitoring the Future surveys and my own research, this shouldn't have come as a surprise to me, but it did. And I was now faced with the horrifying thought that my little son, by the way, he's taller than Dr. Hart, might have taken some illegal drugs. So alarmed, but attempting to appear cool, I asked, "How was the party?" Well, he replied, "Well, Dad, it was whack." Meanwhile, I was secretly looking for signs of drug use. Apart from the obvious ones that occur following heavy drug use, which is rare, there are few, if any. So I decided to just ask if he or others had taken any drugs at the party. He explained that he had not, but some others had drank alcohol and a few had gone to the party to smoke marijuana. And as we drove home, I asked what he remembered from our talks about drugs over the years. And I was so impressed by what he said, I thought it might be helpful to share with others. And here are 5 simple lessons that I've taught my own children about drug use and ways to decrease its harm. 1, the police are a bigger threat to people who look like my son than illegal drugs themselves. By the way, Dr. Carl Hart is an African American. It says, it is a well-documented fact that black people are more likely to be arrested for drugs than other groups, even though they don't use or sell drugs at higher rates. And as a result of an arrest and conviction, individuals may not only lose their freedom, but they almost always lose their civil rights, including the right to vote or serve as a juror. They may be ineligible for federal or state aid or certain types of employment, and some may be barred from obtaining state licenses and holding public office. In other words, those convicted of drug-related offenses can be legally discriminated against, and people who share my son's skin complexion are at greater risk. The fact is that black people are more likely to have their lives damaged by an arrest or conviction than any other that suffer serious drug-related consequences. So, if one must use illegal drugs, he or she should do so only in secure places. Outdoor illegal drug use is simply unwise, especially if you're black. Number 2, the adulterants or cut in some illegal drugs are far worse than the drug itself. He writes, there are few quality controls for manufacturing illegal drugs, and as such, many street drugs contain other components, and in some cases, these chemicals can be more dangerous than the intended drug. One recent example of this is cocaine being cut with levamisole, a drug used to treat cancer and used to deworm animals. Taken in large doses, levamisole can reduce a person's white blood cell count, making them more susceptible to infections. In severe cases, the drug can lead to death. Thus, it's critically important to know and trust the source of your supply. It can literally mean life or death. Number 3 is inexperienced drug users should not model their behavior of experienced drug users. Experienced users tend to take drugs in ways that get them to the brain quickly. Smoking and intravenous injections are popular among this group. Not only do these routes produce the most intense highs, but they also require less amounts of the drug to produce desired effects. Given these appealing features, why should novices be discouraged from smoking and intravenous use, at least initially? Well, inexperienced users will not have developed the tolerance, and this means that smaller doses are likely to produce greater toxic effects, including overdose. Because smoking and shooting drugs intravenously produce more potent effects, the likelihood of harmful consequences is increased with these methods. Alternatively, taking a drug by mouth is usually safer than any other way of consuming drugs because the stomach can be pumped in case of an overdose, something that's not possible to do with smoked or injected overdoses. In addition, when a drug is taken by mouth, some of it is broken down before it reaches the brain, which means the total drug dose and potential drug-related negative outcomes are reduced. Number 4, users of any drug, whether legal or illegal, should maintain healthy sleep habits. Believe it or not, adequate sleep is an essential physiological function for the health and survival of an individual. Deterioration of mental functioning is one of the most noticeable and consistent manifestations of sleep loss. And during prolonged sleep deprivation, there is an increase in fatigue and decline in cognitive and perceptual abilities. In several cases, hallucinations and paranoia may occur. And because amphetamine reliably reduces fatigue and offsets performance decrements, some may repeatedly use this class of drugs as a strategy to mitigate problems associated with sleep loss. And this is less than ideal, of course, because one of the most consistent effects of amphetamine use, of course, is a disruption of sleep, which, of course, leads to many, many dangers and health issues. And finally, number 5, certain drug combinations should be avoided because they increase the risk of harm. Opioids are often used in combination with other drugs. Let me say this. You very seldomly, if ever, will see an opioid overdose alone. People don't tend to overdose just on opioids. Normally, when you do a test, you'll see that it's opioids in conjunction with something else. Like, for example, alcohol or perhaps benzodiazepines, taking other pills. That's typically when you start to see the overdoses take place. And he writes, opioids are often used in combination with other drugs. For example, heroin users frequently use the drugs simultaneously with alcohol. Another popular opioid sedative combination is oxycodone with benzodiazepine diazepam. While it is theoretically possible to die from an overdose of any of these drugs alone, in practical terms, it's very rare. But each year, there are several thousand deaths in the United States involving the use of these combinations. In virtually every overdose death involving a prescription sedative or opioid, for example, some other substance is present. And most of the time, it's alcohol. So one should always take care when combining 2 drugs or any drug with alcohol and read and pay attention to the warnings provided with prescription drugs. I mean, these are just some simple things that you can put in place that will prevent any problems, because I guarantee you the government and the powers that shouldn't be are looking for any sort of in to clamp down further on us. And an administration like Trump, where you have a lot of people touting a lot of good things, and he may make a lot of great change, is making a lot of things worse as well. And this is one of those areas where the I know what's best for you mentality is not what's best for anybody at all. I'm Joe Joseph. This was the DailySheeple.com's Daily News Brief, and I'll have one again for you tomorrow. Have a good night, everybody.